In the autumn of 1374, a hush fell over the great steppe, the Deshti Kipchak. The season had arrived unusually early, painting the seas of feather grass the color of dried blood. The warmth of day gave way to a fragile, biting cold at night, like the first hint of ice. Old warriors, their faces like tanned leather, gazed uneasily at the sky. They had seen empires fall and knew the times were troubled. Comets with fiery tails blazed across the velvet night. Deformed foals were born in the herds, and she-wolves in their dens abandoned their young. It seemed that Tengri, the eternal blue sky, had turned its back on the Ulus of Yoshi. All these ominous signs pointed to one thing. A great calamity was near, for the higher powers had forsaken the Golden Horde. This fever had a name. The Great Troubles, as Russian chroniclers called it. The once unbreakable monolith, which had shaken the world from Egypt to China, was in its death throes. A decade and a half of turmoil began after the murder of Khan Berdebek. His death severed the sacred line of succession. He was the last direct descendant of the great Batu Khan. And then, the dam broke. With kaleidoscopic speed, rulers replaced one another on the throne in Sarai, more than 20 in 10 years. Khans were hastily elected at Kurultais, brought to power through intrigue, and their reigns were pitifully short, a month, a week, sometimes just a day. To hold on to power, each new Khan distributed the last of the treasury and lands to his supporters, undermining the very foundations of the state. The heart of the horde, the Volga region, became an arena of endless slaughter, where the supporters of every deposed Khan plotted their revenge. Meanwhile, in the west, in Crimea, and on the Don, the powerful warlord Mamai held sway. He was not a Genghis and had no claim to the throne, so he ruled through puppet Khans from the line of Batu, holding the real power but lacking sacred legitimacy. In the east, beyond the Yike River, the descendants of Orda Egen, Batu's brother, watched this chaos with contempt and alarm. They were biding their time, seeing how the empire's arteries, the great trade routes, fell into decay. Silk, spices, and gold flowed less and less as the state that was meant to protect them devoured itself. The economic collapse was worsened by total lawlessness. Caravans were robbed by anyone who pleased. Russian river pirates, the Ushkuiniks, sailed their light vessels down the Volga and Kama to the very capital, New Sarai, burning and looting. Tribute from the Russian lands arrived irregularly, and most of it ended up in Mamai's pockets, never reaching the horde's treasury. In this crimson, bloody autumn, where betrayal became the norm and loyalty a folly, the young Muscovite prince, Dmitry Ivanovich, closely watched the horde's agony. He saw that the time had come when a life was worth less than a horse, and power belonged to the one with the sharpest saber and the dagger closest to the throat. He was gathering his strength, preparing for decisive action. In the shadow of these events, an unknown youth from the line of Genghis Khan, named Tokhtamysh, was coming of age in the east. He had no army, no wealth, no patrons, only the sacred blood in his veins, immense pride, and boundless ambition. He did not yet know that he was destined to reassemble this shattered empire and become its last great ruler. His fate would be paradoxical and terrible. First, with incredible energy, he would gather the fragmented empire into a single fist, restoring its power to the levels of Jani Beg's time. Then, blinded by pride, he would challenge the most fearsome conqueror of that era and plunge his people into a catastrophe from which they would never recover. This is the story of his rise and fall. This story is a requiem for a great nomadic empire that flared up in one last crimson fire before being extinguished forever. It is a tale of friendship that turned into a deadly feud, of a dizzying ascent and a crushing fall. And this journey begins in Samarkand, at the throne of the Iron Lame, Tamerlane. For fate often tramples a man in the mud before raising him to the summit. For Tokhtamysh, this mud of humiliation was especially bitter and bloody, for he was a Genghisid, a descendant of the conqueror of the universe. But during the Great Troubles, this was more of a death sentence than an advantage. Too many eagles circled the steppe, each ready to peck a rival to death. And Tokhtamysh belonged to a very influential branch of the Yokids. His father, Tuikoja Oghlan, the ruler of Mangashlak, was a descendant of Tuka Timur, one of the 13 sons of Joki. In the Kok Orda, the eastern part of the Ulus, this line was considered one of the noblest. But high birth offered no protection. On the contrary, it made his father a dangerous rival to the supreme ruler of the Blue Horde, the powerful and cruel Urus Khan. Urus Khan, whose name is controversially translated as Russian Khan, was an extraordinary figure. Cruel, dominant, and ambitious, he was a descendant of Joki from another branch and had managed to establish order in the eastern part of the empire with an iron fist. He had subdued the entire Ulus of Orda Edgen and was already casting his gaze westward, dreaming of uniting the entire Golden Horde under his rule. The noble and independent Tuikoja, Tokhtamysh's father, was a thorn in Urus Khan's side. He likely refused to submit to his authority or participate in a campaign against Sarai. Urus Khan did not hesitate. In 1376, he ordered the execution of his dangerous rival. The decision was swift and final in the spirit of that brutal era. From that moment, Tokhtamysh became the son of an enemy of the people. He was stripped of everything: his Ulus, his wealth, his future. The executioner's axe hung over his head. The only way out, the only chance for survival, was to flee. Where could a disgraced Genghisid flee from his native Deshti Kipchak? Only south, beyond the Sir Daria River, into the lands of Transoxiana. It was there that the star of a new, more fearsome predator of the age was rising. His name was Timur, but he entered history under the nickname Tamerlane, meaning Timur the Lame. Let us pause for a moment to understand who this man was. The fates of Tokhtamysh and Timur were intertwined in a tight knot that only death could sever. They were two sides of the same coin, and to understand the rise and fall of one must understand the personality of the other. Timur, unlike Tokhtamysh, was not a Genghisid. He came from the Turkified Mongol tribe of Barlas. According to the sacred laws of Genghis Khan's Yasa, Timur could not hold the title of Khan and ruled his entire life through puppet, Genghisid figureheads. He himself held the more modest but weighty title of Emir, or commander. He more than compensated for his lack of correct blood with military genius, diabolical cunning, and inhuman cruelty. He was lame in his right leg and had an injured right arm, the result of wounds received in his youth during a skirmish. But these physical disabilities only tempered his will, turning it into a steel blade. By the time Tokhtamysh appeared, he was already the absolute master of Transoxiana, having defeated all rivals in a bloody struggle. His capital was the ancient city of Samarkand, which he sought to make the most magnificent city in the world, bringing craftsmen and wealth from all conquered lands. He was driven by two great ideas: the patronage of Islam and the restoration of Genghis Khan's empire. He was both a monstrous destroyer, building pyramids of skulls, and a fine connoisseur of beauty, gathering poets and scholars at his court. In the autumn of 1376, the fugitive Tokhtamysh arrived at the court of this man, who was like a deadly fire that attracts moths. The scene was filled with drama. A young, exhausted descendant of Genghis Khan with a handful of loyal warriors, stands before the Iron Lame in his dazzling Samarkand palace. In the hall of the Koksarai Palace, its walls adorned with frescoes of the emir's victories, Tokhtamysh was surrounded by fearsome, battle-hardened commanders. On the throne sat Timur himself, a middle-aged man with a large head, pale skin, and a reddish beard. His eyes seemed dull, but his gaze was piercing and frightening. It seemed to penetrate one's very soul. Tokhtamysh told his story. He did not beg for charity but appealed for justice, citing his high birth and Urus Khan's lawlessness. He demanded help as the rightful heir. Timur listened to his tale with a cold, unblinking focus. The emir was a master of political intrigue and instantly recognized the ragged prince as an invaluable tool for his grand game. The Golden Horde was both a threat and a coveted prize for Timur. He well remembered how Khans from Sarai had interfered in the affairs of Transoxiana in the past. A strong, unified horde under Urus Khan was dangerous to him. But a horde torn by internal strife, where he could secretly pull the strings, was extremely advantageous. And Tokhtamysh, a legitimate Genghisid, was the perfect Trojan horse for his plans. The plan was simple. By placing Tokhtamysh on the throne of the Kokorda, and then perhaps in Sarai, Timur would gain a completely dependent ally in the north, one who owed him everything. In the long term, this would allow him to turn the entire Golden Horde into a vassal state. The decision was made immediately. Timur bestowed upon the fugitive truly royal honors. He symbolically called Tokhtamysh his son, gave him the cities of Otrar and Sauron on the steppe border to govern, and provided him with troops, money, and weapons. He gave him everything he needed to return and challenge his enemy, Urus Khan. For Tokhtamysh, this was an incredible gift from the heavens, a unique chance granted by fate. Blinded by the emir's generosity, he probably felt sincere gratitude and loyalty towards him. He did not yet understand that the favor of great rulers is never selfless. He did not see the steel threads with which the Iron Lame was already entangling his destiny. He was merely a blade that Timur was sharpening for a strike against his enemy, Urus Khan. But a blade is a double-edged weapon. No one in Samarkand could have imagined then that one day this blade would turn against its master. The first act of the great drama had begun. Tokhtamysh returned to the steppe. The army and resources received from Timur transformed the exile into a formidable contender. His goal was the throne of the Kokorda, occupied by his mortal enemy, Urus Khan. The path to that throne lay through blood, a series of defeats, and incredible, desperate perseverance. This was not one quick and victorious war. It was a series of desperate attempts, each of which could have been Tokhtamysh's last, ending in his certain death. In the winter of 1376 and 1377, Tokhtamysh invaded Urus Khan's domains, striking the eastern Ulises. At first, he met with success. The Khan was busy in the west, on the border with Mamai, and did not react immediately. Tokhtamysh managed to win over several disgruntled clans. However, as soon as Urus Khan turned his main forces against him, fortune turned away. His hastily assembled detachments were powerless against Urus Khan's battle-hardened army. In the first major battle, he suffered a crushing defeat, lost almost his entire army, and fled again, saving only his own life. He returned in disgrace to Samarkand, to his patron. Any other ruler would have driven him away, but not Timur. The Iron Lame was a player who does not quit the game after the first failure. He viewed Tokhtamysh as a long-term investment. He welcomed his adopted son again, paternally chided him for his carelessness, but gave him a new army, even larger and better equipped. Given a second chance, Tokhtamysh once again crossed the Sir Daria. This time, taught by bitter experience, he acted more cautiously, avoiding major battles and waging a guerrilla war. But fate seemed to be testing his resolve. Urus Khan's eldest son and heir, the young and brave Kutluk Buga, was sent against him. Kutluk Buga was a renowned warrior, worthy of his father. In one fierce skirmish, a stray arrow cut his life short. This death had dual consequences. On one hand, Tokhtamysh eliminated his main rival. On the other, it provoked the uncontainable wrath of Urus Khan, who now craved personal revenge for his son and personally led a campaign with all his forces. The situation for Tokhtamysh became critical when Urus Khan besieged him in the city of Sauron. And then, Timur himself intervened. He could not allow his protégé to be destroyed and his border cities captured. Gathering a huge army, the Iron Lame personally marched to the aid of his son to face Urus Khan. The two great armies met on the banks of the Sir Daria. For several days they stood opposite each other, hesitant to start a battle in which neither was certain of victory. But nature intervened. An unusually severe and snowy winter began. It became impossible to continue military operations, and the opponents withdrew. In that same year, 1377, the mighty Urus Khan died. This truly royal gift of fate opened the way to power for Tokhtamysh. For after the Khan's death, as was often the case, a struggle for the throne immediately began among his sons in the Kok Orda. Urus Khan's heirs proved to be his complete opposite. First, his second son, Tokhtamysh, ruled, but soon died. Then the throne was taken by the third son, Timur Malik, a dissolute man, prone to drunkenness, who had neither the talents nor the authority of his father. His rule caused widespread discontent among the emirs and nobility. Tokhtamysh knew this was his moment. Gathering an army for a third time with Timur's help, Tokhtamysh invaded the Kok Orda. This time, the emirs defected to his side in droves, unwilling to serve the worthless Timur Malik. In the decisive battle, the usurper's army was defeated, and he himself was killed. In the spring of 1378, Tokhtamysh finally achieved his goal. He was proclaimed Khan of the Blue Horde. A 2-year journey, full of humiliation, defeats, and desperate struggle, ended in triumph. Tokhtamysh sat on the throne for which he had fought so long, but this was only the first step. He saw the throne of the Kok Orda merely as a springboard for a leap to the main throne in Sarai, and events in the West were unwittingly playing into his hands. In that same year, 1378, Mamai's protégé, Khan Arab Shah, suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of Dmitry of Moscow's forces in the Battle of the Vozha River. It was the first serious defeat of the Horde's forces by the Russians in an open field battle. Mamai's prestige, already shaky as he was not a Genghisid, was severely undermined. And 2 years later, in 1380, an event occurred whose echo reverberated throughout the steppe. Mamai, having gathered all his forces and allied with the Lithuanian prince Jogaila, marched on Rusas to punish his disobedient vassal. On the Kulikovo field, at the confluence of the Don and Nepriadva rivers, his army was completely routed. It was a colossal blow to his image. He had been defeated by his own tributaries. Tokhtamysh followed these events with intense focus. Mamai's defeat at Kulikovo became his signal to act. He had to strike while his main rival was weakened, demoralized, and without an army. Without a day's delay, he gathered all the forces of the united Kok Orda and moved west towards the Volga region. While Mamai frantically tried to assemble a new army in Crimea, his emirs and warriors were already looking to the east, from where a new force was coming, a young, successful, and most importantly, legitimate Genghisid Khan. In the autumn of 1380, Their armies met on the Kalka River, the symbolic site of the Mongols' first victory over the Russians. But there was no battle. Mamai's warriors simply defected to Tokhtamysh's side. Abandoned by all, Mamai fled with a handful of followers to Crimea, trying to find refuge in the Genoese colony of Kaffa, with which he had long-standing business ties. But the pragmatic Genoese, who always knew which way the wind was blowing, preferred not to quarrel with the new powerful ruler of the horde. According to one version, they simply refused him entry. According to another, they let him in and treacherously killed him. Having eliminated his last rival, Tokhtamysh triumphantly entered Sarai in early 1381. The great troubles, the bloody turmoil that had tormented the steppe for over 20 years, was over. A new ruler sat on the throne of the Golden Horde, young, energetic, and most importantly, an absolutely legitimate Khan. He had accomplished what no one before him had managed. He united both wings of the Ulus of Yoki, the eastern and western, under his rule. A colossal empire from the Irtysh to the Dniester was in his hands. It seemed the Golden Horde was rising from the ashes, ready to reclaim its former glory. And the first thing the new Khan did was turn his gaze to the north, to the vassals who, during the turmoil, had forgotten who their true master was. Tokhtamysh's accession to the throne was met with great relief and hope within the horde itself. 2 decades of bloody chaos had exhausted the steppe. Common nomads and the nobility alike were tired of the strife and yearned for order, stability, and a strong hand capable of restoring the state's former power and prosperity. And Tokhtamysh seemed to be just such a ruler. He was young, energetic, and successful in battle, but most importantly, he was an undisputed Genghicide, in whose veins flowed the sacred blood of the descendants of the conqueror of the universe. His rise to power was seen as the end of a long curse that had hung over the horde. His very first steps on the throne fully justified these hopes. He acted quickly, decisively, and cruelly. A wave of executions swept through the steppe. He mercilessly dealt with the remnants of Mamai's supporters and other separatists. He either eliminated all potentially dangerous and disloyal emirs or forced them to swear allegiance. He immediately restored the chain of command, which had been completely destroyed during the years of turmoil. He appointed his loyal governors to all key uluses of the vast empire. These were mainly emirs and commanders who had come with him from the east, from the conqueror, and owed him everything. At the same time, he set about restoring the economy. His main task was the revival of the caravan routes. He mercilessly destroyed bandits and confirmed the trade privileges for Genoese and Venetian merchants in Crimea and at the mouth of the Don. The minting of a new, full-weight silver coin with his name became a symbol of renewed financial stability. It must be understood that Tokhtamysh was not a reformer, but a restorer. His main goal was to restore the good old order of the times of Khan Uzbek and Johnny Beg, the era of the Golden Horde's greatest power. And this order implied the complete and unconditional submission of all vassals, primarily the Russian princes. From Tokhtamysh's perspective, Dmitry Donskoy's victory at Kulikovo Field was an act of flagrant insubordination by a vassal to his suzerain. For Rus, it was a psychological breakthrough, showing that the horde could be beaten. For the Khan of the horde, it was a rebellion. The fact that Dmitry had defeated his personal enemy and usurper, Mamai, was of absolutely no consequence. According to imperial law, whoever sat on the throne in Sarai was the rightful ruler of Rus. By rising against Mamai, Dmitry, from the horde's perspective, had rebelled against Sarai itself. Tokhtamysh could not let such an act go unpunished. Forgiveness would have been seen as a sign of weakness, as the new Khan's inability to control his tributaries. Punishing Moscow was a political necessity. As early as the autumn of 1380, immediately after Mamai's defeat, Tokhtamysh sent envoys to all the Russian princes, including Dmitry of Moscow. He announced his enthronement and demanded their immediate appearance in the horde, with tribute and obeisance. His envoys subtly hinted that the Khan had defeated their common enemy Mamai, and that a lasting peace should now reign under his legitimate rule. Most of the Russian princes, including Moscow's longtime rivals from Tver and Ryazan, understood perfectly the difference between the usurper Mamai and a legitimate Genghisid, and immediately sent envoys to the horde with declarations of submission. But Dmitry of Moscow, euphoric after his victory at Kulikovo, hesitated. He received the envoys with honor, but he himself did not go to the horde and was in no hurry to pay tribute. The entire year of 1381 passed in this uncertainty. Dmitry apparently hoped that the new Khan would be too preoccupied with the internal problems of a vast, newly united empire to bother with him. This was his fatal miscalculation. He severely underestimated the strength, determination, and ambition of the new master of the Golden Horde. For Tokhtamysh, such behavior was a direct insult and a challenge. After spending a year consolidating power within the horde in the summer of 1382, he assembled a huge army for a punitive campaign. His goal was not just tribute, but a demonstrative humiliation. He wanted to show both the Russians and his own emirs that the era of turmoil was over, that power in Sarai was firm, and that any attempt to challenge it would be drowned in blood. The campaign was prepared in deep secrecy. To ensure surprise, Tokhtamysh resorted to a ruse. On his orders, all Russian merchants in the horde cities were arrested and robbed. Their ships and boats were confiscated so that no one could carry news of the impending invasion to Moscow. The call to campaign was met with enthusiasm in the steppe, which thirsted for rich plunder. A huge army, like a spring flood, moved north. The shadow of the defeated Mamai seemed to demand vengeance, and Tokhtamysh was ready to be the instrument of that revenge. And Moscow, intoxicated by its recent victory, had no inkling of the terrible storm gathering right above its head. The summer of 1382 in Rusas was hot and deceptively calm. The 2 years since the Battle of Kulikovo had created an illusion for many that the yoke had been finally thrown off. Prince Dmitry Donskoy was at the peak of his power and glory. This atmosphere of complacency and self-confidence that enveloped the Muscovite lands played a cruel and bloody trick on them. Tokhtamysh led his army around the traditional routes, along the right bank of the Volga, to remain undetected by Russian border posts. The strike had to be not just powerful, but sudden, like a lightning bolt from a clear sky. The first to learn of the horde's approach was Prince Dmitry Konstantinovich of Nizhny Novgorod Suzdal. He faced a terrible choice: join Moscow and be inevitably crushed, or submit and save his lands. He chose the latter. To prove his loyalty and avert disaster, he not only failed to warn his son-in-law, Dmitry Donskoy, but also sent 2 of his own sons to Tokhtamysh as guides. Prince Oleg of Ryazan, whose lands lay directly in the path of the horde's army, also offered no resistance. He remembered all too well how Mamai had ravaged his principality on the way to Kulikovo and did not want a repeat. He showed Tokhtamysh convenient fords on the Oka River, opening the way for the horde into the very heart of the Muscovite principality. This act of vassal submission, which Moscow regarded as betrayal, deprived Dmitry Donskoy of any chance to organize a defense. The news that the horde had already crossed the Oka caught him by surprise. There was no time to assemble regiments, and many warriors were not ready for another major war. Realizing he could not give battle in the open field, Dmitry took an action that still sparks debate among historians. He left Moscow and went north to Kostroma to gather an army. His cousin, the hero of Kulikovo, Vladimir of Serpukhov, went with him. The prince's departure caused panic and chaos in the capital, left without its supreme leader. The boyars and wealthy citizens, seeing the prince had left, rushed to flee the city. The common people of Moscow, the black folk, felt they had been betrayed and rose in rebellion. They convened a vesh, a popular assembly, closed the city gates, letting no one out, and resolved to defend themselves to the last. Boyars who had not managed to escape were either killed on the spot or forced to join the defense. At the head of this spontaneous defense stood a young Lithuanian prince, Ostej, a grandson of Olgerd, who happened to be in Moscow at the time. On August 23, 1382, Tokhtamysh's advanced detachments approached the city walls. Moscow was well fortified. A new white stone Kremlin had recently been built. Despite the absence of the prince and experienced commanders, the Muscovites were full of resolve. They showered the horde's warriors with taunts and curses from the walls. The chronicles even preserve the name of a clothmaker, Adam, who stood on the Furlovsky gates and reviled the Khan himself. For the first time in its history, Moscow offered armed resistance to a horde army, and this resistance was fierce. The city's defenders not only repelled attacks, but also made daring sorties. They even had firearms, so-called tyufyaks, and early primitive cannons. The horde's warriors, unaccustomed to long and bloody sieges, suffered heavy losses. For 3 days, their assaults were unsuccessful. Realizing the city could not be taken by force, Tokhtamysh resorted to a trick that had brought success to his ancestors more than once. On the 4th day of the siege, August 26th, high-ranking horde Murzas rode up to the walls. They were accompanied by those same Russian princes, the sons of the Prince of Nizhny Novgorod, Vasily and Semyon, which was intended to inspire trust in the besieged. They addressed the Muscovites with peaceful speeches. They swore that the Khan had not come to wage war against the city and its inhabitants, but only against the rebellious Prince Dmitry. He supposedly only wished to see his patrimony, Moscow, and would grant peace and forgiveness to all if they opened the gates and came out with gifts. Not a single hair will fall from your heads, they promised. Exhausted by the 3-day siege and constant tension, the Muscovites believed the oaths. The decisive factor was the presence of the Russian princes, who acted as guarantors of the agreement. Prince Ostej, the boyars, and the clergy decided to trust them and open the gates. A solemn procession, led by the prince and priests, exited the city. It was a fatal mistake. As soon as the procession passed through the gates, the horde's warriors treacherously fell upon the unarmed people and slaughtered them all. Prince Ostej was the first to fall. The horde's cavalry poured into the open and defenseless gates. A terrible, merciless massacre began in the city. People were killed indiscriminately. Those who hid in churches were burned alive along with the buildings. The city was plundered completely. The horde's warriors took everything of any value: gold, silver, furs, fabrics. The entire princely treasury was captured. Thousands of survivors were driven into slavery. Moscow, according to the chronicler, was turned into smoldering ruins, littered with corpses that no one was left to bury. After spending only a few days in the ravaged Moscow, Tokhtamysh, with immense booty, began his return journey. Along the way, his detachments burned Vladimir, Zvenigorod, and Mozhaisk. Only near Volokolamsk did Vladimir of Serpukhov's retinue manage to defeat one of the horde's detachments, but it was just a drop in the ocean. When Dmitry Donskoy returned to his capital, he saw a scene of total destruction. The lesson taught by Tokhtamysh was cruel, but extremely effective. In the autumn of that same year, Dmitry was forced to send his eldest son, the future Vasily I, to the Horde, to receive the Yarlik, the patent for the grand princely throne, from the Khan's hands. Rus' once again acknowledged itself as a tributary of the Horde. The payment of tribute, the Horde's exit, was resumed in full. The campaign of 1382 became the zenith of Tokhtamysh's power. He had achieved all his goals. He had brutally punished the disobedient vassals, restored his authority over Rus, and shown the whole world that the Golden Horde had risen from the ashes and was once again as strong as ever. Returning to Sarai with immense plunder and glory, sitting in his palace, Tokhtamysh may have come to believe that his power had no limits. He was the Lord of the North. His word was law. But it was at this moment of supreme triumph that the seeds of the pride that would ultimately lead to his downfall were sown in his soul. He began to forget to whom he owed his rise. From Samarkand, Tamerlane closely watched the successes of his son. He saw that his protégé had gained too much power, too quickly. On the southern borders of the Horde, a new, far more terrible knot of conflict was already tightening, the Khwarezmian knot. For several years after the burning of Moscow, Tokhtamysh was the absolute master of a colossal empire. His power over a vast territory from Siberia to the Balkans was the strongest and most undisputed since the time of Khan Johnny Beg, who had ruled almost half a century earlier. All internal enemies were destroyed, and external vassals were brought to complete submission. Sarai once again became one of the greatest capitals of the world. Tokhtamysh proved himself not only as a cruel conqueror, but also as a far-sighted ruler. He understood perfectly that the empire's power was based on trade. He actively patronized the caravan routes and confirmed all privileges for the Genoese colonies in Crimea and on the Don, which brought huge customs duties from the transit of goods into his treasury. During his reign, the cities of the Volga region, New Sarai, Haji Tarkhan, Bulgar, experienced a real flourishing. Archaeological finds testify to a high level of craftsmanship in pottery, jewelry, and weaponry. On the coins minted in his name in vast quantities, he was styled with magnificent titles such as the Just Sultan Tokhtamysh Khan, may his reign be prolonged. His power over Rus' was absolute. The princes paid their tribute without complaint, and Dmitry Donskoy's eldest son, Vasily, spent several years in the Horde as a hostage of honor. Tokhtamysh distributed patents for rule as he saw fit, skillfully playing the Russian princes against each other. It was a classic imperial policy, known by the principle of divide and rule. His might was recognized by all his neighbors. The distant Mamluks of Egypt, traditional allies of the Horde, sent embassies with rich gifts. The Lithuanian prince Jogaila, who also became the king of Poland, sought an alliance with him. It seemed that Tokhtamysh had achieved the impossible. He had restored the empire of Yoti in all its former splendor and greatness. And it was at this moment, at the pinnacle of his fame and power, that he made his main, fatal mistake. He decided that he was not just equal to, but superior to his former patron, the Emir Timur. He forgot that only a few years earlier, he had been a ragged fugitive, saved by the Iron Lom. In his eyes, Timur was merely an upstart, a non-Genghicid, while he himself was the legitimate descendant of the conqueror of the universe. From this logic followed a conclusion monstrous in its consequences. All lands once part of the Mongol Empire, including Transoxiana and Timur's other conquests, rightfully belonged to him, Tokhtamysh, by birth. This pride, multiplied by real political contradictions, led to the clash. The bone of contention, the formal pretext for war, was Khwarezm, an ancient, rich region in the lower reaches of the Amu Darya, a major center of crafts and trade, a true jewel of the East. Historically, Khwarezm was part of the Golden Horde, but during the Great Troubles, the local dynasty had effectively seceded. Timur, consolidating his power, could not tolerate his neighbor's independence, and in 1379 finally conquered and subjugated the region. When Tokhtamysh united the horde as a restorer of the old order, he demanded that Timur return Khwarezm. The demand was presented in an ultimatum-like and defiant manner. Tokhtamysh's envoys behaved arrogantly, which enraged Timur. He considered Khwarezm his legitimate conquest, paid for with the blood of his soldiers. To give it up would be to show weakness and acknowledge Tokhtamysh's supremacy. He flatly refused. From that moment, relations between the father and son began to deteriorate rapidly. Tokhtamysh started supporting rebellious emirs within Timur's own state, but his most treacherous move was the invasion of Azerbaijan in 1385, which occurred at the very moment Timur was waging a difficult war in Persia. This territory was also historically disputed, but by this time, Timur firmly considered it his sphere of influence. Tokhtamysh's troops swept through Azerbaijan with fire and sword, taking and completely sacking its richest capital, the city of Tabriz. The booty seized in the city was colossal. According to historians, there was so much of it that even common soldiers were laden with jewels and silk. After sacking Tabriz, Tokhtamysh's army turned back, and although it suffered some losses from local attacks on the return journey, for Timur this raid was the last straw. This was not just a military act, it was a stab in the back, delivered during a war on another front. It was a personal, mortal insult, a violation of all oaths and concepts of gratitude. The son had not just gone to war against the father, he had robbed his house. And the Iron Lame was known for his vindictiveness and never forgave betrayal. War between them became inevitable. Timur began preparing for a major campaign to the north, into the very heart of the Deshti Kipchak. He understood perfectly that the war would be long and difficult. Tokhtamysh was a formidable opponent, the ruler of endless steppes, whose cavalry was no less numerous and fierce than his own. But the decision was made. He had to punish the ungrateful upstart once and for all and destroy the threat from the north. Tokhtamysh, intoxicated by his easy victory and rich plunder, also prepared for war. He was absolutely confident in his strength and believed that in an open steppe, war, his nomads had an undeniable advantage over Timur's army. The two greatest commanders of the age, two former allies who had become mortal enemies. They were preparing for a decisive battle, with not just the possession of Khwarezm at stake. At stake was power overall of Central Asia and Eastern Europe. The world held its breath. The winter of 1390-1391 was a time of frenzied military preparations. Timur prepared for the campaign with a meditative, terrifying thoroughness. This was not to be just another raid, but a campaign of total annihilation. He announced a levy of all the forces of his vast empire. From every corner of his realm, from India to the Caucasus, from the Hindu Kush to Mesopotamia, regiments flocked to Samarkand. For several months, weapons were forged in smithies, armor was sewn in workshops, and provisions were gathered throughout the empire. Timur personally inspected the arriving troops, preparing them for the greatest campaign. His army was not just a horde, but a complex, superbly organized military machine. It was divided into corps, divisions, and regiments. It included heavy cavalry, light horse archers, and infantry, which was even armed with primitive artillery and Greek fire. The total number of this armada was about 200,000 men. In January 1391, this gigantic army marched north from Tashkent. Its target was Tokhtamysh's capital, the city of Sarai. The path to it lay through the vast, hostile, and almost uninhabited steppes of the Deshti Kipchak, where nature itself was an ally of the nomads. Learning of Timur's advance, Tokhtamysh did not engage in battle at the borders. He chose the classic nomadic tactic that had brought them victory many times, the scorched earth tactic. His flying detachments retreated deep into the steppe, driving away livestock, burning grass, and poisoning wells, to lure the enemy's huge army into a trap and exhaust it with hunger and thirst. Thus began a march unprecedented in military history. For 5 months, Timur's huge army moved through the lifeless steppe. It was a true death march. Soldiers suffered from hunger, and a mass die-off of horses began. Many lost heart, and even the most steadfast emirs grumbled, urging their leader to turn back before it was too late. But the Iron Lame was adamant. He personally shared all the hardships of the campaign with his soldiers, ate the same meager food, and slept on the bare ground. His unbending will, like a steel rod, held this huge mass of people together and led them forward, through despair and death. Tokhtamysh closely watched the enemy's advance. He was confident in the success of his tactics and saw Timur's army dwindling. He waited for the moment when the enemy would be completely exhausted to deliver the decisive blow. In June 1391, the armies finally met in the Trans-Volga region, near the Kundurcha River. Tokhtamysh decided the time for battle had come. His army, on its own land, had no supply problems. In terms of numbers, it was not inferior, and perhaps even superior, to Timur's exhausted force. On June 18, 1391, one of the largest battles of the Middle Ages began. Tokhtamysh arranged his army in a crescent shape to envelop the enemy's flanks. Timur, a brilliant tactician, saw through this plan. He arranged his army in 7 corps, creating several lines of echelon defense and keeping his best units in reserve under his personal command. In front of his lines, he ordered a ditch to be dug and barriers erected to break the nomads' initial fierce charge. The battle began with an attack by the Horde's cavalry on the right flank of Timur's army. The blow was of such crushing force that the ranks of the Iron Lame's warriors wavered and began to retreat. For a moment, it seemed that Tokhtamysh was winning. His warriors broke through the first line of defense and, breaking formation, rushed to plunder Timur's rich baggage train. But it was at this critical moment that Timur displayed his genius. He threw his elite reserve into the battle, which delivered a devastating counterattack on the flank and rear of the Horde's breakthrough forces. Simultaneously, another of his corps, which had been hiding in a ravine, attacked the weakened center of Tokhtamysh's army, disrupting its battle order. The Horde's attack faltered. A fierce, bloody hand-to-hand fight began, which, according to chroniclers, lasted for 3 days. It was a real slaughter. The outcome of the battle was decided not only by Timur's brilliant tactics, but also by the iron discipline of his soldiers, who, unlike the Horde's warriors, fought as a single mechanism. On the 3rd day, Tokhtamysh's army, having suffered monstrous losses, could not hold and broke. The retreat quickly turned into a panicked flight. Timur immediately organized a ruthless pursuit. His cavalry chased and cut down the fleeing warriors for hundreds of kilometers, giving them no chance of escape. The losses of the Golden Horde's army were catastrophic. According to some sources, up to 100,000 men perished. Among the dead were many noble emirs and even one of Tokhtamysh's sons. The Khan himself, with a handful of bodyguards, barely managed to escape, once again demonstrating his phenomenal skill for survival. Having won, Timur did not march on Sarai. His army was too exhausted by the long campaign and the bloody battle. Instead, he camped for 26 days at the battle site, celebrating the victory and gathering trophies. Tokhtamysh's headquarters, his harem, and immense riches were captured. Laden with booty, he turned back to Samarkand. The Battle of Kondurcha was a terrible blow to Tokhtamysh. It was his first major defeat. He had lost the flower of his army, his prestige as an invincible warrior. His authority in the horde was seriously shaken. Many emirs in the east began to turn away from him. It seemed that he was finished once and for all. The first crack had appeared in the monolith of his restored empire, but Tokhtamysh would not have been himself if he had given up. His character possessed an astonishing ability to recover from the most terrible blows. He had lost a battle, but not the war. He had fled, but he was not broken. Licking his wounds, he nurtured his anger and was already thinking of revenge. Any other ruler in his place would have been immediately overthrown by his own emirs. But Tokhtamysh possessed incredible vitality and a keen political instinct. He understood the psychology of the steppe perfectly. The nomads respect only strength and luck, and he had to prove to everyone as quickly as possible that he was still strong and capable of leading. Returning to Sarai, he found his empire cracking at the seams. Many eastern uluses had broken away. Timur, as he left, had prudently placed his puppet khans from the descendants of Urus Khan, Tokhtamysh's old enemies, at the head of the Kok Orda, thereby planting a mine under the state's unity. But Tokhtamysh acted with astonishing energy. Relying on the core of his power, the nomadic aristocracy of the Volga and North Black Sea regions, he announced a new levy for the army. He once again used his main trump card, the authority of a legitimate Genghisid, appealing to loyalty to tradition and promising new victories and rich plunder. And the steppe, strangely enough, responded to his call. The Golden Horde's ability to quickly regenerate its military forces was phenomenal. Every nomad was a born warrior, requiring little training. In just 2 or 3 years, Tokhtamysh managed to assemble a new army, no smaller in number than the one defeated at Kondurcha. He restored his authority over most of the Ulus of Yoki. The Russian princes, seeing that the Khan was strong again, dutifully paid tribute. The horde's economy, based on control of trade routes, also recovered quickly. Tokhtamysh once again felt powerful, and this newfound strength, unfortunately for him and his people, went to his head again. He had not learned from his defeat. Instead of focusing on strengthening the state, he decided to seek revenge. His hatred for Timur, mixed with envy and a sense of deep humiliation, demanded vengeance. He sincerely believed that the defeat at Kondurcha was just an accident, a tactical error, and he longed to prove that he, a Genghisid, was stronger than the rootless lame emir. In 1394, he decided the time for a new strike had come. He entered into negotiations with the Egyptian Mamluks and the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid, trying to create a broad anti-Timur coalition. But his impatient and adventurous nature did not allow him to wait until this alliance was fully formed. He decided to act immediately. In the autumn of 1394, while Timur was busy with a war in Mesopotamia, Tokhtamysh once again struck from behind. Gathering all his forces, he invaded the Caucasus through the famous Derbent Pass, the ancient gates for nomadic invasions from the north. His target was the state of Shirvan, a vassal of Timur. This campaign was even more audacious than the raid on Tabriz. Tokhtamysh acted not as a robber, but as a full-fledged master, invading the very heart of his enemy's domains. He ravaged the cities of Shirvan, seized rich plunder, and, meeting no resistance, turned north, where he camped on the Terek River, defiantly awaiting Timur's reaction. It was an open challenge thrown in the face of the Iron Lame. Timur's reaction was predictable. When news of the new invasion reached him, his fury knew no bounds. The ungrateful son had not only failed to repent, but had dared to launch a new, even more brazen attack. The emir's face darkened, and, as chroniclers write, he swore a terrible oath, this time not just to drive Tokhtamysh out, but to destroy his entire Ulis, to ruin its cities and exterminate its people, so that no ruler after him would ever again know trouble from that quarter. He immediately ceased all military operations in the south and ordered his entire army to move towards the Caucasus. The second great campaign of Timur against the Golden Horde had begun, but this time he was driven not by cold political calculation, but by an all-consuming, icy thirst for revenge. He was marching not to conquer, but to destroy. Two gigantic armies, led by two mortal enemies, were again moving towards each other. Tokhtamysh awaited Timur on the North Caucasus, on the bank of the Terek River. He was confident in his advantageous position. His army was fresh and full of strength. He believed he had learned from his past mistakes and would achieve a decisive victory this time. It was his last chance, his final stake in the great game for supremacy. He did not know that he was leading his horde not to revenge and glory, but to a true apocalypse. On the banks of the Terek, not only his personal fate, but the fate of the entire Golden Horde was to be decided. A storm was gathering, threatening to wipe from the face of the earth not just a Khan, but an entire world created by his great ancestors. In the spring of 1395, a gigantic city of yurts and tents stretched along the northern bank of the Terek River, the camp of Tokhtamysh's army. Here, on the border of the endless steppe and the gray Caucasus Mountains, he decided to give his enemy a decisive battle, confident of his victory. The mood in his huge, fresh army was combative. The horror of the defeat at Kondurcha had faded from memory, replaced by a thirst for revenge and the anticipation of rich plunder. It seemed that this time, fortune would be on the side of the legitimate Genghisid, fighting on his own land. Meanwhile, from the south, through the passes of the Caucasus, Timur's army was approaching. His march was both triumphant and monstrously cruel. He destroyed defiant fortresses and built pyramids of skulls. On April 15, 1395, his vanguard reached the Terek. The two greatest armies of the time stood facing each other, separated by the swift river. For several days, the opponents maneuvered along the banks, seeking an advantageous position to cross. Tokhtamysh fortified his bank, preparing to meet the enemy. Then Timur employed a military ruse. He feigned a retreat upstream, and Tokhtamysh, thinking the enemy was afraid, followed him. At night, finding a convenient ford, Timur forced a crossing of the Terek. A fierce battle for the bridgehead ensued, but the iron discipline and fury of Timur's warriors broke the resistance of the horde's screening forces. By morning, the bulk of his army was already on the northern bank. Tokhtamysh had no choice but to accept a general battle under unfavorable conditions. The Battle of the Terek became one of the most grandiose and fierce in history. Tokhtamysh, having learned from the bitter experience of Kondurcha, arranged his army in a deeper, echeloned formation. He strengthened the center and placed his best light cavalry on the flanks, ready for an enveloping maneuver. Timur, on the other hand, staked everything on a powerful ramming blow in the center and his signature move, a strong flanking reserve. His battle order was even more complex. In the first line stood infantry, protected by large shields and field fortifications, and behind them was the heavy cavalry for the decisive strike. The battle began with the traditional exchange of arrows, after which Tokhtamysh launched his cavalry into an attack on both flanks. On the left flank, the Horde's warriors met with success. They crushed the enemy's forward units and began to push them back. Tokhtamysh was already anticipating victory, but his joy was premature. At the critical moment, just as at Kondurcha, Timur brought his strategic reserve into play. He personally led a counterattack of elite heavy cavalry, striking at the junction between the center and the flank of the Horde's army. According to some chroniclers, it was at this moment that some of Tokhtamysh's emirs, bribed by Timur, treacherously abandoned the battlefield. The center of Tokhtamysh's army, attacked from the front and the flank, faltered. And then Timur used another trick, a psychological one. Across the field, his warriors, who knew the Turkic language, began to shout, "Khan Tokhtamysh has fled! The Khan has fled!" This cry, repeated many times, spread across the entire battlefield. Panic erupted in the ranks of the Horde's warriors, who were already disoriented by the blow from Timur's reserve. Everyone believed that their Khan had truly abandoned them. The formation disintegrated. Soldiers who moments before had been fighting desperately now thought only of their own survival. The retreat turned into a disorderly flight, and then into a monstrous slaughter. Timur's cavalry pursued and mercilessly exterminated the demoralized fugitives. The defeat was complete and final. The army of the Golden Horde, in effect, ceased to exist as an organized force. Tokhtamysh himself, once again showing a miracle of resourcefulness, escaped again, fleeing with a small group to the north into the forests of Bulgaria. But this time, Timur was not satisfied with just a victory in battle. He decided to fulfill his terrible oath and destroy the Ulis of Yochi itself. After the battle, his army moved deep into the Horde's territory. What began can be described as the economic and demographic destruction of an entire civilization. Timur's army, like a swarm of locusts, swept across the entire territory of the Horde. The conqueror's goal was not subjugation, but complete destruction, so that the Golden Horde could never again threaten his empire. All the largest cities were taken, plundered, and burned to the ground. New Sarai, Old Sarai, Haji Tarkhan, Bulgar, Tana. The populations of these cities were either massacred or driven into slavery in Central Asia. Archaeological excavations at the site of the Horde's capital, Sarai, show a thick layer of ash and destruction dating precisely to this period. The city never recovered from this blow and was abandoned forever. Timur systematically destroyed the economic foundation of the Horde's power. He destroyed the complex irrigation systems in the Volga region and smashed the Genoese trading posts in Crimea. Most importantly, he forcibly rerouted the northern branch of the Great Silk Road, which had passed through the Horde steppes to the south, through his capital, Samarkand. Timur's campaign of 1395-1396 was a mortal blow to the Golden Horde. It was not just a military catastrophe, it was a civilizational collapse. The destruction of cities, the undermining of international trade, and the extermination of a significant part of the settled population set the Horde's development back by a century. After this blow, the unified state effectively ceased to exist. The Horde once again became a wild steppe, torn by internal strife. On its ruins, new warring states soon began to emerge: the Kazan, Astrakhan, Crimean, and other Khanates. The apocalypse on the Terek was the end of the empire of Yochi. And the main culprit of this catastrophe was its last great Khan. Blinded by pride and a thirst for revenge, Tokhtamysh challenged a force he could not handle. He plunged his country and his people into the fire of war, which burned them to the ground. His personal tragedy became the tragedy of an entire civilization. The defeat on the Terek and the subsequent devastation of the Horde turned Tokhtamysh into a perpetual exile. He was a Khan without a Khanate, a commander without an army. Of his former greatness, only memories and a grand title remained. But even in this seemingly hopeless situation, he did not give up. The last decade of his life is a story of desperate struggle. Timur did not pursue him, appointed a puppet Khan in the ruined Sarai, and went south, considering Tokhtamysh finished. And once again, the Iron Lame underestimated his enemy. As soon as his troops left, Tokhtamysh began to gather supporters around him again, those who did not want to submit to the conqueror's appointees. He managed to assemble a small army once more. But now, within the Horde itself, he had a new, deadly enemy, the powerful Emir Edigu. This cunning and domineering warlord, who had once served Timur, became the de facto ruler in the region between the Volga and Yaik rivers, and had no intention of relinquishing power. Edigu came from the noble Manghit clan, and like Mamai, was not a Genghis, so he ruled through puppet Khans. He relied on his loyal Manghit tribes, the future Nogais, and became the de facto master of what remained of the Golden Horde. The return of the strong and legitimate Tokhtamysh was completely unacceptable to him. A long and merciless struggle began between them. Tokhtamysh managed to seize power in Sarai several times, but Edigu drove him out again and again. The old Khan's forces dwindled in these endless conflicts. Realizing he could not succeed alone, he began to seek help from outside the Horde and turned west, to the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. At that time, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, under the rule of the ambitious Grand Duke Vytautas, was at the peak of its power, stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. And Vytautas, just like Timur before him, saw in the disgraced but legitimate Khan Tokhtamysh an invaluable tool for realizing his own geopolitical plans. Vytautas's dream was to subjugate the weakened Golden Horde by placing his own vassal Khan on its throne. He received Tokhtamysh with honor, settled him in Kiev, and promised military aid. In return, the former ruler of half the world issued Vytautas a Yarlik, granting him authority over all the Russian lands, which had long ceased to belong to him. The culmination of this alliance was a major campaign organized by Vytautas in 1399. He assembled a huge army, Lithuanian and Russian regiments, Polish knights, detachments of German crusaders, and the remnants of Tokhtamysh's forces. The goal of the campaign was to defeat Edigu and place Tokhtamysh on the throne of Sarai. Vytautas was so confident of victory that he had already distributed the Horde's uluses among his nobles in advance. The decisive battle took place on August 12, 1399, on the Vorskla River. Negotiations were held before the battle. Edigu's protégé, the young Khan Timur Kutluk, offered to recognize Vytautas as his father. But the proud Lithuanian duke demanded in return that Lithuanian insignia be minted on the Horde's coins, which meant complete submission. At that moment, Edigu himself arrived at the Horde's camp. He interrupted the negotiations and defiantly told Vytautas that he could not be the Khan's father, as he was not a Genghisid, and that, on the contrary, Vytautas should recognize their Khan as his elder brother and come to pay homage. This reply was tantamount to a declaration of war. Vytautas, who had numerical and technical superiority, attacked first. Initially, his army was successful, but Edigu used the nomad's favorite tactic, a feigned retreat. He lured the heavy Lithuanian army deep into the steppe, and then his cavalry, outflanking the enemy, delivered a devastating blow from the rear. Vytautas's army was surrounded and completely routed. This defeat became one of the most terrible catastrophes in the history of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Dozens of noble princes and knights, including heroes of the Battle of Kulikovo, perished in the battle. Vytautas himself barely escaped, and Tokhtamysh, seeing the battle was lost, was one of the first to flee. The defeat on the Vorskla was his final catastrophe. He had lost his last powerful patron and was now doomed to endless wanderings. The last years of his life were a series of humiliating attempts to find refuge on the outskirts of his former empire, constantly pursued by Edigu's men. His end was ignominious. In 1406 or 1407, after more than a decade of wandering, he was caught. On Edigu's orders, a detachment of warriors led by one of Urus Khan's sons, the very man Tokhtamysh had overthrown at the beginning of his journey, tracked him down somewhere in the region of modern-day Tyumen. The circle was now complete. In a short, fierce skirmish, the last great Khan of the Golden Horde was killed. His body, according to legend, was simply left lying in the steppe. Thus ended his life, full of dizzying ascents and crushing falls. He was the last to unite the Ulus of Yochi, and after his death, the process of the empire's disintegration became final and irreversible. The death of Tokhtamysh in the Siberian wilderness was not a major event, but his life, like a stone thrown into water, left ripples that spread for centuries. His legacy is paradoxical and dual. He was both the last great restorer and the chief gravedigger of his own empire. The main outcome of his reign was the final and irreversible collapse of the Golden Horde. He was the last Khan who managed to gather the shattered Ulus into a single fist. But his own pride and adventurism provoked the war with Timur, which dealt the Horde a mortal, fatal blow. Timur's campaign of 1395-1396 was a true civilizational catastrophe. The destruction of urban centers, the disruption of trade, the extermination of the population, all this deprived the Horde of its economic and political foundation. After this blow, it could never recover as a single, centralized empire. On its ruins, new states began to grow like mushrooms after the rain. The Great Horde, the Nogai Horde, the Kazan, Crimean, Astrakhan, and Siberian Khanates. The world of the Deshti Kipchak entered a new, feudal phase of its history, where a unified empire was replaced by constantly warring successor Khanats. The second crucial consequence was the change in the balance of power in Eastern Europe. Paradoxically, it was the defeat of the Horde by Timur, provoked by Tokhtamysh, that created the conditions for the future rise of Moscow, which he had so eagerly sought to humiliate. The weakened Horde could no longer effectively control its vassals. The Russian princes continued to pay tribute for almost another century, but it was no longer the total dependence of the past, but a complex diplomatic game with several Horde centers of power. It was in the 15th century, after the Horde's defeat, that the Principality of Moscow began its rapid growth, culminating in the final overthrow of the yoke in 1480. The third consequence was the redrawing of the entire geopolitical map of Central Asia. The war led to a colossal strengthening of the Timurid Empire. By destroying his powerful rival in the north, Timur was able to focus on conquests in other regions. The defeat of the Horde also led to a fundamental change in world trade routes. The northern branch of the Great Silk Road, which passed through Sarai and brought the Horde fabulous revenues, fell into complete decline. The main caravan routes now ran further south, through Timur's capital, Samarkand, which further enriched his state and permanently drained the economy of the Deshti Kipchak. the image of Tokhtamysh himself in history remains extremely contradictory. For Russian chronicles, he is the fierce Tsar, the cruel destroyer of Moscow. In Persian chronicles, he is an ungrateful traitor and a perfidious fool. But if we look at him from the perspective of the horde itself, he appears as a truly tragic figure of Shakespearean scale. He was the last paladin of a passing era, the last ruler who thought in terms of a unified empire of Genghis Khan. He was a talented commander and an energetic administrator who managed to achieve the almost impossible, to resurrect his state from the ashes. His main misfortune was that he lived in an era when a player of a completely new type appeared on the scene: Timur. Tokhtamysh was a representative of the old, nomadic tribal aristocracy. Timur, although he relied on nomads, was the creator of a new type of state, a military feudal empire with a strong centralized power, based on a settled civilization and a regular, disciplined army. In the clash of these two worlds, the old world was doomed. Tokhtamysh lost, not because he was a bad commander or a fool. He lost because the wheel of history had turned. His extensive clan-based empire could not, in the long run, withstand the rigid military administrative machine created by Timur's genius. His story is the eternal drama of a man who flew too high and burned his wings on the sun. He desperately wanted to restore the past, but in the end, he only hastened the arrival of the future. A future in which there was no longer a place for a unified Golden Horde. But there was a place for the Tsardom of Muscovy, the Ottoman Empire, and the new Turkic Khanates that grew on the ashes left after the Great War between the last great Khan and the Iron Lame. We have told this story. If it resonated with you, subscribe to our channel, give us a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Many more great destinies lie ahead.